Well, as you know, I would have given this paper tomorrow, and all the errors would have been corrected this evening. So this isn't as good as the paper would have been had I given it tomorrow. And I'm going to move back and forth from the handout to some written parts. So some places where I tend to get more confused than normal, I'll read. Other places I can sort of wing it. Epistemic closure matters because it seems to be responsible for much mischief in matters regarding local and global skepticism and in matters related to easy knowledge. If closure holds, then every circumspect knower of the fact that she has hands also knows she's not being deceived by a highly powerful, malevolent demon hell-bent on making it only appear that way. But how can we know that? Also, if closure holds, every circumspect knower of the fact that the table is red would also know that it's not white being illuminated by a red light. In such a case, it appears that our knowledge has been amplified too much, for it seems that we can come to know that the table is red by looking at it. But how could we come to know that it is not white being illuminated by a red light by looking at the table? Now, the claim that I'm going to try and defend, best as I can, is that closure, properly understood, helps to remove the power of the arguments for academic skepticism, or at least one argument for academic skepticism, and it provides a basis for recognizing that the knowledge we have is very far from an ill-gotten gain. So what is epistemic closure and what is it not? First, I think everybody will agree this is what it means for a property of propositions to be closed. A property of propositions phi is closed under entailment just in case for every proposition x, if x has phi and x entails y, then y has phi. That's what I'm going to take closure to mean. I think that's what everybody takes it to mean. And here are two things I'm going to define. Since I'm abbreviating the paper, they may not come up in what I'm going to read or talk about, but they will come up in the discussion, I think. So I think we better get them out on the table. A proposition P is justified for S if and only if S has adequate reasons available for P which are not ultimately overridden by other available reasons. It's pretty clear that given the discussion this morning, that some people are going to think, well, it's the only if goes, but not the if. Following first, let us call this propositional justification. This form of justification at least appears closed. A belief that P is doxastically justified, so the belief state itself, for S, if and only if S is acting in an epistemically responsible way and believing that P. Doxastic justification is only close to being closed because you may believe something and it entails something else, but you may not believe, have the belief state. And so you couldn't be doxastically justified because you don't even have the belief state. What's crucial to note here is that S need not do anything for a proposition to be justified for her. All that is required is that there be adequate evidence available to her. On the other hand, in order for a belief state to be doxastically justified, S must at least gather the evidence and employ it properly. Now, I'm going to take the two closure principles that are going to be relevant to the discussion here to be the following. I take it that these principles highlight what's going to be at stake. That's going to be questioned by some of the commentators. The closure principle for justification. If X is propositionally justified, that was that thing I defined just a little while ago, for S, and X entails Y, then Y is propositionally justified for S. The close closure principle with regard to knowledge is something like this. If X is known and X entails Y, then S is in a position to know that Y. And I'm going to be taking knowledge in this paper to mean something like, not something like, to be exactly like, a true belief that's based upon good reasoning that's not defeated. And the reason I'm going to do that is I think that's the correct account of knowledge. to begin with. And second, I think that's the kind of knowledge that the skeptic is challenging. So it may not be fully reflective knowledge in Ernie's sense, but at least it's way beyond the kind of detector knowledge that garage doors have and children might have and most of us have on many occasions. Now, given those constraints, CJ, the closure principle for justification, would be true just in case, necessarily, whenever there are adequate reasons available for S to believe that X, and X entails Y, there are adequate reasons available for S to believe that Y. And what I'm going to mean by good reasons is something roughly like this. The premise is in a good argument, which has P as its conclusion. And by a good argument, I mean something, if it's a deductive argument, then the conclusion follows deductively. And you haven't begged the question. If it's a non-deductive argument, then the strength of the claimed conclusion follows from the evidence you've presented, and it doesn't beg the question. So CK, the one with regard to knowledge, would be true just in case necessarily whenever X is known by S and X entails Y, then all of the conditions for knowledge are satisfied for Y, with the exception of the belief condition. The next sentence is so important I put the do not twice in it. CK and CJ do not, specify any epistemic priority between X and Y. And that's a crucial thing to notice. In particular, they do not require that the adequate reason available for the entailed proposition, Y, be the entailing one, X. All it says is that necessarily if you have adequate reasons for X and X entails Y, then you have adequate reasons for Y. It doesn't specify what the relationship between X and Y is, except the one entails the other. So it doesn't require that the adequate reason for Y be X. And it doesn't require that there is some reason, call it R, that's adequate for X and for Y. It doesn't require that either. And finally, they do not require that the adequate reasons for X include Y. I mean, sometimes you want to get the, if, for example, I want to say that a certain theorem is true or a certain scientific hypothesis is true, I see it entails this thing, well, sometimes the entailed proposition is the evidence for the entailing one. And all I'm claiming is, at this point, that the closure principles don't dictate the epistemic priority between these propositions. There's a foundationalist bias here I want to avoid. And that foundationalist bias is that there's some fixed epistemic priority among propositions, such that on any given occasion, if X is a good reason for Y, then on every occasion, X is going to be a good reason for Y. Let's take the toughest case, or what I think is the toughest case. I seem to be seeing redly. Is that always epistemically prior in the sense, does it provide me with the reason for believing that I am seeing red, or that there is red? There's a red object. I think a foundationalist is going to be committed to the claim, or at least this is what I think they're committed to, yes, I'm seeing redly, or I'm being appeared to redly, is always my evidence for there's a red object. And I don't think that's true. I think I can be wondering, now, is it redly that I'm seeing now, or is it greenly? I'm not quite sure. And it seems to me what I could do is go to a drawer marked red objects and pull them out. And by God, yes, it was redly that I was seeing. Or no, I misremembered it was greenly. Or I could ask other people, are those things red that I'm looking at? I can't remember what this experience is like, what kind of experience this is. So I think this foundationalist bias that there's always an epistemic priority, a fixed priority among propositions is mistaken. What does it mean for reasons to be? That's going to become important, and I'm going to embellish that argument a little bit. What does it mean for reasons to be available? Well, on the one hand, you could have a fairly lax, lenient standard. You could say a reason is available for a person just in case that person's epistemic practices are such that, were they to engage in those practices, they'd come up with a reason. That could be a very lax notion. It could be a very stringent notion. You could say a reason is available to somebody only if it's properly hooked up with their current beliefs, either entailed by their current beliefs or something close to entailment. And I'm going to duck that issue. I don't think, a lot hinges on that, but I don't think anything in this paper hinges on that. So as long as you take availability of reasons in the antecedent of the principles to be the same notion as the availability of reasons in the consequent, I think we're okay. Now, I said that on some occasions, one proposition could serve as a reason for another, and on another occasion, the second one could serve as a reason for the first. Let me just amplify that just a little bit. And here I think I want to read something. Now, what differentiates one occasion from another? My answer, and I know the commentator is going to talk about this, so that's another reason to mention it now, so the target's out there. My answer is a neo-Wittgensteinian one. Being able to provide reasons requires that some propositions are occasion relative up for grabs, the ones requiring the reasons, and others are occasion relative bedrock propositions, the one that serves as reasons and are not up for grabs. Of course, the occasion can change, and something that was bedrock relative to one occasion can be up for grabs relative to another occasion. If, for example, on one occasion I'm asked what reason I have for believing that Socrates is mortal, I could answer that all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human. On another occasion, if I were asked why I believe that all humans are mortal, I could give, well, look, Socrates is a human and mortal among my reasons for thinking that all humans are mortal. So it's a question of what's up for grabs on the occasion. And I can marshal my beliefs in different ways depending upon what's up for grabs. That may not have an easy translation into Portuguese, up for grabs. Means unsettled. What it is, what the game is about. I don't know the history of that expression. In any case. A crucial question to ask in a discussion about global academic skepticism is this. Is there some occasion on which everything is up for grabs? I think the answer is clearly no. If what would be required on such an occasion is that no reasons are available to provide a good argument for the propositions that are up for grabs. I mean, if something's up for grabs, there has to be some way to resolve the issue, it's not a genuine doubt. For if everything were up for grabs, nothing could be available as a reason because nothing could qualify as an occasion-relative bedrock proposition. On the other hand, if what is meant is that once a reason is given, it can be challenged, and the reason then offered can be challenged, etc., that seems to me perfectly possible. Put another way, the question, is there a reason for everything I believe, is ambiguous. If it means, is there some reason or other available for each thing I believe, the answer could be yes. If it means, is there one reason for all the things I believe, I think the answer is no. Academic skepticism. Let's use the following abbreviations, and here is a standard argument for academic skepticism. This is the one I think most of us would recognize as the thing that's on the table at the moment. Let M be any Moorean proposition. I have hands, there are other people, the earth has existed for many years. SK is, S is in a skeptical scenario in which M is false, but appears just as if M were true. And JSX, meaning S, has good reasons that are available and not ultimately overridden for X. Then the argument is the simple, familiar one. If S is justified in believing that M, then S is justified in denying that SK. Well, S is not justified in denying that SK, therefore S is not justified in believing that M. Notice I took the argument not to be about knowledge, I took the argument to be about justification, and sometimes the argument is given about knowledge, but they'll think the knowledge condition isn't fulfilled because the justification condition isn't fulfilled. It's typically about, do we have good enough reasons? Now, I said that I didn't think there was any, the closure didn't entail that there was an epistemic, one pattern of epistemic priority between the entailed and the entailing proposition. But if the skeptic thinks that premise one is true, then the skeptic must think, I think, that at least one of the following three patterns of epistemic priority do obtain between y and x in the general principle. Either x is epistemically prior to y and is available as a reason. So your reason for thinking y is true is x. Or the skeptic, in this case, substitutes m and sk. We'll talk about that in a second. The second could be, look, x and y are epistemically on a par, so that r is some reason, good reason for x, if and only if it's a good reason for y. So they sort of come together or fall together. And the third path is that y is epistemically prior to x and is available as a reason for x. If you look at the little diagrams, they must think that with regard to the person who thinks closure is true must think with regard to every pair of propositions, one of these three paths obtains on each given occasion. Either r, you have some evidence for r, that gets you down the path to x, that gets you to the path to y, or there's some r which gets you to either x or y, your choice, or there's some path r that gets you to y that then gets you to x. If one of those three paths obtained on every occasion, then closure would be true, because necessarily whenever you had adequate reasons for x, you'd have adequate reasons for y. That's the point of those three paths. Now let me read a little bit. Path 1 reasoning is employed whenever we can use a justified proposition x that entails another one y as our reason for y. Suppose I have good reasons to believe the 5 Euclidean postulates. Maybe they strike me as clear and distinct, or maybe a highly trusted teacher has told me that they're true. On such an occasion, I could use the conjunction of those axioms as my reason for believing the theorems they entail. This is the path 1 case, where the entailing evidence is the evidence for what's entailed. On such an occasion, I could use this conjunction. What better argument could there be for the theorems? For if I had reasoned if I had reasoned that way on a particular occasion, then on pain of circular reasoning, on that same occasion, the theorems could not be available as reasons for thinking the axioms are true. So I use the axioms as my reason for the theorems. Nonetheless, one could imagine occasions in which the path 3 type of reasoning could be employed. Suppose that I was ignorant of the 5 postulates, but I'd measured the legs of the hypotenuse of right triangles and concluded on the legs and hypotenuse, and concluded on inductive grounds that the sum of the squares of the legs is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. I could then use the reason that the postulates, or the subset of them that entail the Pythagorean theorem, are true because by assuming them, the appearances can be saved. On such an occasion, the entailed proposition serves as evidence for the entailing one. So, but what I'm claiming is on no one occasion could you do both. You can't then turn around and use the entailed one for the entailing one if you had done it the other way. Path 2 cases are those when there's a proposition R that is a good reason for both X and Y. For example, if I have a good reason to believe that Anne has 2 brothers, that reason would be a good reason for believing that Anne has 1 brother. In such a case, the entailed and entailing proposition are on an epistemic par, because the very same reason R that provides the inference path to X also provides the inference path to Y. So much for the abstract characterization of the closure principle. How would they apply to the argument, the one I'm calling the standard argument, for academic skepticism under consideration here? Given premise 1 in the standard argument for academic skepticism, the skeptic must think that one of the 3 paths just described correctly depicts the evidential priority between M and not SK on the occasion when you're not justified in believing that M is up for grabs. That's the thing that's up for grabs. Are we justified in believing that here's a hand or any other Moorean proposition? My argument would be, first, that if the skeptic thinks that either path 1 or path 2 is the correct depiction, closure is playing no role in the standard argument, because the conclusion, namely not JSM, would be reached without employing premise 1, which is closure. And Second, that the skeptic cannot provide a basis for thinking that path 3 is the correct portrayal. Suppose the skeptic held that the appropriate evidential priority is portrayed by path 1. Then in giving her argument for premise 2, namely that you're not justified in believing not SK, in the standard argument, she would have to show there's no reason R that is available for M. Because it is granted in premise 1 that if there is a path from M, then there's one to not SK, because that's what path 1 says, on the occasion when not JSM is up for grabs. But whatever argument she provides for the claim that there are no adequate reasons available for M would show that M is not justified. So you can't, what you'd have to do if you think it's path 1, you can't break it between M and not SK. You have to break it before you get to M. Well, if you do that, you've already argued for the conclusion, and you don't need the first premise. In other words, the conclusion would have to be established in giving the argument for premise 2. Thus, premise 1, closure, is useless. It plays no role in the standard argument. Now, I'm not claiming there is no such argument for premise 2. The point is that closure is not useful in motivating the conclusion, because such an argument for premise 2 would not employ closure, and that argument would be sufficient to establish the conclusion. Suppose the skeptic held that the proper evidential priorities are depicted by path 2. That is, that M and not SK are epistemically on a par. The two propositions, M and not SK, are epistemically on a par on some occasion. Just in case for every reason R on that occasion, R is an adequate reason for M, if and only if R is an adequate reason for not SK. That's what it means to be on a par. In arguing for premise 2 in the standard argument, the skeptic must provide a basis for thinking there is no such reason available. The skeptic cannot argue that there is an adequate reason for M that is not an adequate reason for not SK, because that would be inconsistent with the conclusion. The conclusion is there isn't one for M. The skeptic cannot argue that there is an adequate reason for not SK that is an adequate reason for M, because that would be inconsistent with premise 2. What the skeptic must claim is that there's no adequate reason for SK, since there's no adequate reason for either M or not SK. Did I say SK? I meant not SK in both cases. What the skeptic must claim is that there's no adequate reason for not SK, since there is no adequate reason for either M or not SK. But if there's such an argument for premise 2, once again, closure is useless to the academic skeptic, because the conclusion would have been reached without employing closure. Finally, suppose the skeptic thinks the proper epistemic priority between not SK and M is that depicted in path 3. Here the skeptic would be claiming that not SK, the entailed proposition, must be among the reasons for believing that M, so you have to eliminate that alternative first. Unlike the other two options just considered, in which CJ was not needed by the skeptic, here and only here is closure potentially useful in the skeptic's argument. But on what basis can the skeptic claim that we are required to have evidence available against the skeptical scenarios obtaining as part of our reasons for believing that we have hands? In general, must we have evidence against the contrary of a proposition as part of our evidence for believing that proposition? That's not an easy question to answer, but we can begin by showing that one can't be required to do so with regard to every contrary. Let M be the proposition for which we're seeking adequate reasons. Here are two contraries of M, not M and P. That's one contrary of M. Here's another contrary of M, not M and not P. That's another contrary of M. If it's required that our reasons for M include the denial of both contraries, so you have to eliminate all the contraries, then we're requiring that our reasons for M entail M, since the set not, is this on your, it's not, yes it is. We're 2/3 of the way down, so on this second page. So if you look at that, that set, the set that has the negation in front of those two contraries, entails M. So the skeptic would be requiring essentially that in order to have knowledge of contingent empirical propositions, I have to have evidence that entails it. And if the skeptic wants to win that game, I'll give it to them. That's not the game I thought we were playing. I thought we were playing the game in which we thought that we could know something on the basis and be justified in believing something on the basis of very strong but not necessarily entailing evidence. So what contraries of M need to be included in the adequate available evidence for M? Consider a case with a long history, the case of identical twins. Cicero considered such a case of the twins Publius Geminus and Quintus Geminus, who looked exactly alike, at least from the distance and perspective from which we normally identify people. If we believe there were such twins, then that looks like Publius will not provide the basis for doxastically justifying the belief that the person we are seeing from a normal distance and perspective is indeed Publius. In such a case, adequate reasoning would seem to require including, and it's not Quintus among the reasons. Now contrast this case with one in which we think we see Publius, but an incredulous bystander claims that in order to have an adequate reason for believing it's Publius, we must first eliminate the possibility that it's Magicus's dog, that Magicus has transformed into a duplicate of Publius. Presumably, we would not have to include the denial of that alternative among the available reasons because there's absolutely no reason to think it's true, unless, of course, we have a reason to think that Magicus has the ability, a suitable motive, and the opportunity. Now, my suggestion is that we're required to include the denial of an alternative to M as part of the evidence for M only when there is some reason, however slight, for thinking that the alternative is true. And that requires that it is, of course, logically possible for there to be some reason, however slight, that it is true. But, and here's the place where I'm sure people are going to say, wrong. Well, this may be, there may be places that we've already covered where you thought that. But I think this is going to be a place where a lot of people are going to say, all right, here we go. But if SK were true, there could not possibly be any reason for thinking it to be true. Put another way, if there were a reason for thinking that I'm a brain in a vat or the skeptical hypothesis is true, then SK would not be true. To see that, suppose there were some phenomenon that necessarily obliterates all traces of its existence. I mean, all traces. If it exists, there's no evidence that it does. A global skeptical scenario is like that. If it were true, there could be no reason for thinking it's true. For there are only two types of reasons. Again, what? A priori reasons and empirical reasons. I assume there can be no a priori reason for thinking SK is true. There could be a reason for thinking it's logically possible that SK is true, but that isn't the reason for thinking it is true. There could be no empirical reason for thinking that SK is true, for if SK were true, all so-called empirical reasons for thinking that SK is true would be only pseudo-reasons. If, for example, I were a Viv, everything would look just as it does. That is, everything would look just as though I'm not a Viv, but rather had hands and all the other nice accoutrements. That's the way the skeptic typically presents the consequence of being a Viv. But it's also true that the Viv hypothesis, like any global switched world hypothesis, is designed to discredit all, and I mean all, empirical reasons. Thus, the Viv hypothesis also discredits all reasons for thinking that we're Vivs. All so-called evidence about the external world is really pseudo-evidence and completely worthless if the Viv hypothesis is true. Thus, it is not logically possible for SK to be true and for there to be empirical evidence of its truth. So if the academic skeptic were to suggest that I better eliminate SK as an alternative to M prior to believing that M, I should respond by saying, look, I'm under no obligation to do so, because either there's no reason to believe that SK or SK is false. If there is a reason to believe that SK, then if there is no reason to believe that SK, then I need not eliminate it as an alternative to M. So either I need not eliminate SK or SK is false. Take your choice. In either case, SK is not a serious rival of M. Now that strikes me as a perfectly good response to an academic skeptic who holds that path 3 depicts the appropriate evidential priorities. Hence, the mere mentioning or considering an alternative even in a serious manner with a raised eyebrow, does not make it a relevant alternative. In order to know that there is a hand, I do not first have to provide